before the Romans' grateful eyes. These minor uprisings were warning shots, and the Romans did not dismiss them. Rome was in the process of annexing the Gallic tribes right out of existence. Eventually, the barbarians would have to fight or die. The Romans knew this, and so made their preparations accordingly. But before the final showdown came, Roman attention was diverted from the Gallic threat in a direction it had never looked before: east. The Adriatic had stood as the unofficial dividing line between the eastern and western Mediterranean for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But the division was about to break down completely. The process of integration begun by Pyrrhus as he tried to impose the east on the west would be completed by Rome when they ultimately imposed the west on the east. Rome's first official contact with the Greek world as an equal power came around 230 BC, after Illyrian piracy finally grew to be intolerable. Ancient Illyria, what we know of today as the Balkans, represented the far west reaches of the Greek world. Greeks in Athens or Corinth viewed the Illyrians as barbarians living on the fringe of the civilized world and hardly worthy even of contempt. But then again, the Greeks of Athens and Corinth viewed the Macedonians the same way, so we can fairly take their snobbery with a grain of salt. The new kingdom of Illyria had formed around 240 BC, and at its height controlled the entire eastern seaboard of the Adriatic, including the once independent kingdom of Epirus. The kingdom did not extend far inland, however, and as a result, the Illyrians looked to the sea as their major source of wealth and power. But the economy of this new power was not run by an association of scrupulous merchants and traders, but rather by a gang of pirates and privateers. Much like the Barbary states of the 18th century, Illyria was a recognized sovereign funded entirely by criminal activity. They were tolerated by the Greeks because the targets of the piracy were non-Greeks, and the Greeks often at a reduced price, what with a low overhead outright theft provides. The Romans, however, who were the targets of the piracy, took a very different view. It was a menace that had to be dealt with. Little was done at first, but when the Illyrians began to boldly attack Roman port cities, the dam of restraint was broken, and in 228 BC, Rome launched itself against the Illyrians with brutal precision. At the same time as the military campaign was launched against the Illyrian cities along the Adriatic, Rome also launched a diplomatic mission to Greece to explain what they were about to do. The Romans wanted to make sure the Greeks understood that the war with Illyria was limited in scope and would be over when the pirate menace was crushed. Yes, Roman troops were about to set foot in Greek territory, but there were no plans for them to remain longer than necessary, and no further invasions east were planned. The Greeks took this to heart, and the Romans were well received, marking the official beginning of diplomatic relations between Rome and the great cities of Greece. The Greeks still viewed the Romans as backward barbarians, but the power of Rome was at least acknowledged, the Corinthians even going so far as to invite Rome to take part in the Isthmian Games, which finalized the acceptance of Rome into the Greek political world as a full equal. There was also another element to the diplomatic mission, which was secondary to the mission at hand, but would far outstrip the Illyrian pirate question in ultimate importance. The Macedonians had been consolidating their empire again, much to the dismay of Greece proper. The Romans too looked at the successors of Alexander with concern. They had their hands full with Carthage in the west, and had no desire to have their back door kicked down by a newly resurgent Macedonian empire. The Romans needed allies in Greece who could tie the hands of Macedon and protect the Roman eastern flank, and the Greeks needed money and equipment to pull off any sustained engagement. These mutual overtures would come to fruition during the Second Punic War, when Philip V of Macedon signed a treaty with Hannibal to join in the war against Rome. Philip may have been able to tilt the scales decisively against Rome, but he never made it out of Greece, as Roman allies there opened up front after front, and kept Philip plugging leaks in his empire, rather than marching his armies across the Italian peninsula and joining with Hannibal to form an invincible anti-Roman army. Rome was saved then by the diplomatic groundwork laid at the beginning of the Illyrian expedition. Free to take out the pirates with Greek blessing, the Romans then proceeded with deliberate strategic and tactical skill that completely outclassed the Illyrians. In less than a year, the major cities of Illyria were under Roman control, and the Illyrian queen was sending envoys to Rome asking for peace. The terms were harsh. Illyrian ships were banished from the Adriatic, and southern Illyria, opposite the heel of Italy, was annexed and established as a Roman protectorate. The Romans had achieved a dual victory. Not only had they eradicated the threat of piracy, but they also had set up now a permanent base on the far side of the Adriatic, where they could keep an eye on the growing Macedonian threat. The quick end to the Illyrian campaign turned out to be a major blessing, not just for its own sake, but because the Gallic storm was brewing again, and this time it would not simply break up and leave a pleasant afternoon in its wake. This time, the Gauls were united and driven. In 226 BC, the Gauls began to pour through the Alps, intent on sacking Rome a second time. To face the invasion, Rome mustered an unprecedented number of men. They turned out the full fighting capacity of the Italian peninsula, with every Italian community committing themselves fully to what could only be considered a fight for civilization itself. Accounts have as many as 700,000 infantry and 70,000 cavalry being raised. Not all of these were first-rate legionnaires, and many were employed merely for local defense, but still, it gives you an idea of how seriously the Romans took the threat. Armies were divided up and sent to cover key strategic points, but the Gauls were able to more or less march all the way to Clusium in southern Etruria before they met any resistance. The first battle went poorly for the Romans, and their armies were trapped by the Gauls, but the invaders took the opportunity to pillage the countryside rather than maintain their vigil over the Romans, and the trapped legions were able to escape. This greed wound up being the undoing of the Gallic army. When the Gauls settled into camp that night, the decision was made by the chieftains to put the sack of Rome on hold for the moment. The chiefs recognized that their men were too laden with booty to fight effectively, and unwilling to give up their spoils, decided to march back north and deposit their gains before returning to finish the job. They chose a route up the Etruscan coastline that offered the easiest passage for their overloaded pack animals, but this proved to be a horrendous mistake. The passage lay between the sea to the west and steep hills to the east, and only permitted movement north or south. A Roman army picked up the Gallic movement and came down from the north, plugging up the passage. The Gauls decided to turn around and try a different route, but it was too late. The Roman army they had let escape came up from the south, trapping the Gauls in the pass. The Romans were delighted at their strategic coup, but immediately were filled with unease as they watched 50,000 trapped and desperate Gauls ready themselves for a fight to the death. It was a hard and bloody battle, but the Gauls eventually could not maintain both fronts and were crushed between the two Roman lines. With the main force of the Gauls now destroyed, the Romans turned to the other, subsidiary Gallic army still roaming the countryside, defeating them one by one. The threat posed by the invasion thus ended. The Romans pressed their advantage and cleared the Gauls out of Italy altogether. The Italian land just south of the Alps, which had long been considered a part of Gaul, was now firmly Roman territory and would remain so for the 750 years left to the empire. The years between the two Punic Wars were eventful and successful for Rome. They had opened up relations with Greece and established a cadre of allies who would play an important role in the Great War against Hannibal. They had secured the safety of their trade and communication routes to the east, which would be more important than ever as the West erupted into all-out war. After the fight with the Gauls, Italy had never been more united, and it was this unity more than anything in his attempt to break Rome. His plan was to beat the Romans on the battlefield and then convince Rome's Italian allies to turn on the great city. But to his chagrin, they refused to abandon Rome, even after Hannibal demonstrated how much better he was than the Romans time and time again. The frightening invasion of the Gauls and the Romans' ability to beat it back endeared them to their Italian allies, who were in no mood to turn on the great protector of Italian civilization when Hannibal came knocking. Next week, we will cover the events leading up to the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian conquest of Spain, and the Roman response. It is impossible to argue that the Romans were not knowingly breaking the treaty with Carthage when they agreed to come to the aid of Saguntum, but as in the case of Messana in Sicily, They saw an opportunity to establish a foothold in Spain and took it, damn the consequences. And the consequences, needless to say, were vast. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 22, Prelude to the Second Punic War. Rome and Carthage had spent the years after the First Punic War dealing with their own problems and paying little official attention to one another. But the focus of the two great powers would soon turn to each other once again and lead to a confrontation, this time over Spain. This confrontation would be the spark for what is arguably the most important period in Roman history, the Second Punic War. Entering the war, Rome was a regional power on the rise, but still recognizably the same political entity that had emerged from the devastation of the Gallic sack 170 years before. However, at the end of the war with Hannibal, a 20-year trial of immense physical and psychological endurance, Rome had transformed into the invincible juggernaut that would conquer the Mediterranean. Hannibal would prove to be Rome's most impressive enemy, and after surviving the bold Carthaginian invasion of Italy, the Romans simply turned and steamrolled the rest of the known world. The importance of the Second Punic War is also measured by the fact that after Scipio's final victory at Zama in 202 BC, Roman elites almost immediately began to lament the loss of Roman virtue and nobility. The total domination Rome had achieved after defeating Carthage allowed steadfast frugality to be usurped by excessive debauchery. Never again would the literati look at their contemporaries with anything but contempt, and the idea that Rome had fallen from grace was, from that point on, simply taken for granted. It speaks volumes then of the impact the Second Punic War had on the Romans, that it would essentially mark the close of an alleged golden age where all men were clones of Cincinnatus, and usher in a new, modern era where all men were corrupt, hedonistic, and unworthy of their great ancestors. But for now, Rome was still a paradigm of virtue. While the Romans were focused elsewhere, dealing with the Gallic invasion and Illyrian piracy, the Carthaginians began to quietly build an empire in Spain. Well, not the Carthaginians as a whole necessarily, just Hamilcar Barca. After being driven from Sicily, Hamilcar returned to Carthage and briefly stewed in his juices before hatching a plan to revenge himself upon the Romans. He knew that a direct assault on Rome would be a suicidal fool's errand, so he looked instead to Spain for an opportunity to build up the wealth and power necessary to re-engage the hated Romans. He pitched the Carthaginian Senate on the idea of a Spanish invasion, couching the benefits of such an adventure in economic terms: the opportunity for traders to make up for the loss of Sicily, and the possibility of drawing from Spanish resources to pay the war indemnity owed to the Romans. The Senate was quick to approve Hamilcar's plan, as much to get the disgruntled soldier out of Carthage as much as anything else. It had been the Carthaginian Senate, after all, who had been the ones who had left Hannibal twisting in the wind for so many years in Sicily, and they were understandably anxious to get rid of the charismatic general. So in 337 BC, without a navy to speak of, Hamilcar marched his army west across North Africa and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was at that time populated with tribes whose prowess on the battlefield